On this episode, I'm excited to have you hear from Meredith Anne Miller. Her official biography says that she is, quote, a pastor, speaker, and writer with a deep love for the local church and its potential to impact and transform communities. Now, while all of that is true, it obscures a lively and complex personality. Meredith gives a clear, compelling, and challenging rationale for the necessity of a different form of church. She aspires to listen carefully both to the world and to God. Among other things, she speaks of dialoging across difference, pursuing justice, and elevating the voices of people who have been marginalized in church spaces. You may disagree with her on points, but I don't think you'll be able to easily dismiss her. She's fresh, transparent, and articulate. She's educated and fair-minded, yet at ease with her own thoughts. And on occasion, she's been known to swear. Normally, I do some editing on my conversations with people to keep the episode at a manageable length, but in this case, I left most of our talk together intact. I hope you'll enjoy it, and maybe even find some small good thing in it.
You're listening to a small good thing.
Good thing.
Small good thing with Steve Zell.
Welcome, Meredith. Thanks so much for coming on my show.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
It's very exciting for me to talk to you. And in my little email invitation, what I said to you is that the reason I want to talk to you is this whole business that you're in the process now of starting or planting a new church. I don't know what the terminology is nowadays. But as I indicated to you in my email, and so I'm just going to tell the audience and you right up front, I have some doubts and questions about starting a new church. But before we talk about that, I need to also say to the audience that while I know you, I sort of don't know you because I haven't talked to you for 20 years.
That feels like some time.
It's been 20 years, and you were in high school at that time, and a lot of things have happened. And I'm wondering if maybe you would be willing to sort of just give us and give me the streamlined version of where you've been, what you've seen, what you've done the last 20 years or so, and that might give us some context and sort of set us up for what you're doing now and the kinds of questions that I want to ask you and hear what you're thinking. So can you do that?
Definitely. So since I was 16, I went to undergrad at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, and I majored in religious studies and then also in Spanish. Spent a semester in Costa Rica when I was an undergrad, which was wonderful and very impactful as far as just continuing to have an understanding of diverse communities and being positioned differently than white suburban Southern California. And then I went on straight from undergrad to Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena and did a Master's of Divinity there. That's where I met my husband, Curtis, in our Greek class. As one does, it's very romantic.
That's right.
And yeah. And we got married and I convinced him to stay in Southern California forever. He'd moved around. I never much had, unless you count moving around from, the 210 to the 101 as moving. And just as we did that, there was a job that came up at Willow Creek Community Church over in Chicagoland, Illinois. And Curtis said I should apply. And I said, I saw that listing 3 weeks ago and I'm not going to. He said, no, you really should apply. And so I did. And we went through that process, and that ended up resulting in a job with Promised Land, which is the children's ministry at Willow Creek for birth to fifth grade. And so we went out there 5 years ago and I wrote their curriculum, and we did a big update for everything from age 2 to grade 5.
Now, I'm just going to interrupt you. I want you to keep going, but just for the sake of my listeners, Willow Creek is a very large organization, right? It's a very, has some sort
Willow Creek is, yes, one of the largest churches in the country, has been for nearly 40 years, and is particularly notable because it was one of the first mega churches. And so if you kind of follow American church history, you had the main line, and through the 70s, it sort of started to decline. And part of the response from some sector of the American evangelical church was to imagine what would happen if you got flexible with the form of church and tried to stay true to Jesus, and then what would come from that. which meant casual. It meant rock bands. It meant sermons that felt more relevant. It meant using cultural cues in a different sort of way, movie clips and so on. So all that was happening sort of through the early 80s. It felt very new and very different. It was quite controversial as it launched. And Willow Creek was one of the originals in that movement. They're also unique because they were one of the originals to support women in leadership and ministry and have women who preached on their teaching team in a time when it was pretty hard to find. So we joined up with them.
What year was that you went out there?
So we went out there in 2014. We had our son Riley at the time. He was almost 1.5. And then when we were out there, our son Peyton was born. And so they are now 4 and 6.5. And then 3 weeks ago, we moved back to Southern California, not too far from where I grew up.
Let me go back to Willow. You started there in 2014, I think you said, and you wrote the children's curriculum for their program out there.
Yeah, I did. And we had a team that did that together. And so I wrote directly all of the small group materials. Kids at Willow are in small groups starting at age 2. And so I wrote all the small group things that they would do together. And then a team worked on writing what the teacher actually said to sort of set up that time. And so there were other writers who did that. And I was kind of part of the editing and the direction setting for how we would teach kids. A big part of what was neat about that was that we were kind of trying to respond to some pretty important conversations in children's spaces about what really forms long-term faith and what is the best strategy for giving kids a foundation. And a big part of that has been a shift away from sort of having the human in the story as the main character, and instead really making sure God's the main character of a story. And that just means you tell stories differently. If God's the main character, it means the humans can do things differently if they are no longer having to be a hero to be imitated in every story we tell. And so it was really fun to kind of rethink that and just adjust the focal point of how we were teaching kids the Bible and what we were inviting them to do with the Bible. We kind of moved away from telling kids how to apply the Bible and be obedient, gave them a little more space to explore and poke at what they were hearing and ask questions of it. So yeah, that was kind of what we worked on for those years.
Wonderful. If you've listened to my podcast at all, you know I have a big concern for children and a love for children. So it's great to hear what you were doing out there. So I want to go back to, at some one point there, you decided to stop doing that and to move back to Southern California.
Yes.
What was your thinking there? What happened to bring you to that place?
My husband, Curtis, was out pulling weeds one day, and we had come to a point of realizing that we wouldn't be able to stay at Willow forever, which was our original hope. We just kind of wanted to be there, stay put, find places to serve, and call it home. And we had sort of realized that there was enough of a gap between the things we most loved in church life and who Willow was that we weren't going to be able to stay forever. We're both, Curtis and I, pretty opinionated folks with a pretty clear sense of what we love and want to do, and we don't always fall in line maybe as well as some. And that wasn't a problem, but part of how we have managed that part of our personality is to know when it's time to be gracious and sort of be aware of ourselves and be open to where maybe God would want us to go. Curtis was pulling weeds. All of that is in the background, and he has this sense we should start a church. We have never wanted to start a church. We had never, in the 10 years we were married, ever talked about starting a church. We had never dreamed of starting a church in seminary. Like, this was not our thing. And I sort of smiled and nodded and said, sure. And we just let it sit there for a bit. And what we agreed was that we would be serious about that question, that we would be prayerful about it. And that was kind of all we committed to. And we weren't going to rush making a decision about that. And we weren't going to force that one way or another. We just sort of said we would take it more seriously. And that led to kind of a 2 or 3 year process of getting to know people who were in church starting spaces, including a church in Boston that really did it differently than we thought. Because one of the reasons we didn't want to is that we only had this image of like John Wayne riding into town on his horse and going door to door and introducing himself and drawing people to a new church with force of charisma and strength of vision, and all that felt gross, to be honest. And we didn't want to do it if that's what it meant. And so this church in Boston that we met was planting churches only in Boston because that's their city and that's where they loved. And they were doing it with teams. They had women in the mix, which is very rare in church planting spaces. And they sort of gave us imagination for a different model for how a church might start. And so much so that we thought we might go to Boston and join them, and went through a whole process with them. They were part of the Evangelical Covenant denomination. So we went through church planters assessment with them, which meant spending a couple days in Minnesota, and there are therapists there, and you bring a presentation, and it's a pretty intense couple of days, good, but intense. And we did that. We were recommended out of that, and ultimately pushed pause because at that point, Curtis, my husband, was offered a full-time role at Willow in their discipleship ministry. And up until that point, he had been doing other things part-time in contract with Willow, but never something quite as much of a match as this. So we went ahead and pushed pause, and Curtis went on the discipleship team, and I stayed with Promised Land, and we just kind of let the whole question hang in the air until Willow went into its crisis. And for people who are familiar with Willow, March of 2018, a new article came out in the Chicago Tribune that pointed out that Bill Hybels had some pretty serious allegations that were being leveled against him, and that the group that had been trying to work that out with him felt like the process had stalled through the regular channels, and so they felt like they needed to go ahead and tell that story in a more public way, and it created just a lot of turmoil around Willow. For Curtis and I, that meant revisiting whether it was time for us to go. I think everyone on staff asked that question. Like, what does God want me to do? Does God want me to stay at Willow and help? Is God asking me to go ahead and move on? And I think every person on staff at Willow has a different answer that God invited them into. I don't think there's a right answer about what to do with Willow's crisis as a staff member. But for us, it was pretty clear pretty quick that we were going to go. And it was just a matter of figuring out what that looked like. And so we were back to that question, like, do we try to start something or do we join another church staff? And maybe similar to your skepticism about the need for a new church, we had a bit of skepticism about just trying to join another church and do some other person's vision. And so we just started looking back into planting and reconnected with that church in Boston, which led to exploring going to Silicon Valley with them. They had enough people from Boston Tech that they wondered if maybe they wanted to have a place in Silicon Valley where those folks who move could join. We went up and looked at that a bit. And ultimately, in the middle of that, some friends here at home said, we're kind of around. A lot of us are empty nesters. We got some time. We got some resource that maybe could help. You could come back. We could all be crazy in Southern California together.
Wonderful.
And there we were.
I want to come back to the church in Boston in a little bit, but thanks for bringing me all up to speed. You've had a very varied life. So, okay, I want to come to the reason for this podcast and my big question. Great. And before I do that, just full disclosure, so you know where I'm coming from, and so our listeners know where I'm coming from. I started a church about 35 years ago. And I was part of that like you. It was me and another guy who started a church. It was a small church, as all churches are when they start out. And that church continues to this day. So when I'm speaking to you, I'm speaking to you with that in my background. But I have to tell you, if I knew then what I know today, which would be impossible, I wouldn't do that. And so here's the question, Meredith, and I'm going to kind of make it a pointy stick. On purpose. I'm not trying to poke your eye out, but I want to make it as I want you to see where I'm coming from, and then you can approach that because I want to hear how you're thinking about it, and that is it's just simple. Does the world, your city, does any city really need one more church on the block? Now, there are a couple of main reasons that I'm thinking about it, and that is. Frankly, the sheer numbers of churches that litter every street, and I know that's not a nice way of saying it, but sometimes that's what I feel like when I'm driving around my town. There are 2 and 3 churches on every block. And Meredith, I think, maybe it's just me, but I think it makes Christians look somewhat incredible, if not ridiculous, to non-believers. I mean, the existence of so many churches, in my mind, seems to suggest that they can't even get along with one another, let alone love one another like Jesus taught. Why in the world would anyone believe what these churches are supposedly teaching inside these churches?
Yeah.
So I'm very doubtful of this, but you are a thoughtful person, and you're way ahead of where I was when I was starting a church. How do you approach that question? Have you thought about that? And what is your line of thinking on that whole deal?
I would say that very question is a big part of why I never wanted to start a church. I had a pretty strong sense that there are so many, and certainly they're doing good things. You got to be able to join one and help it be healthy, help it be good, help it accomplish its mission in its community. Like, certainly there is a place amidst all that is out there. And that was a huge reason why I felt very comfortable with wanting to be in my case, suburban mega churches, and not particularly having any interest in starting a new church. So I agree that it's a good, important question. And what I found shifted in me bit by bit, a couple of things, I think. If the question is, do we need one more cookie cutter variation of the churches that already exist, led by the people who currently have church power? No, I don't really know that I think another trendy white guy needs to start another church. Because if you're going to ask pointedly, I'll respond a little pointedly.
Sure.
If the question is, are the existing forms of church effective for the purposes God might have in our communities here in, for instance, Southern California? I think that maybe not. I think that there is good happening within the churches that exist. I think there are limits. And I wonder if there is a need for some new church expression to fill gaps that the existing models are never going to fill. In particular, as it relates to dialoguing across difference, as it relates to pursuing justice, as it relates to elevating the voices of people who have been marginalized in church spaces. I think there is more to probe into if you are thinking about churches that are curious about those spaces. If you rewind, we just talked about, if you rewind to the late 70s, when the contemporary megachurch was sort of beginning, the origin questions were simply, why don't my friends want to go to church anymore? What if I took those answers seriously instead of judging them for them? And what if I held true to Jesus but got flexible about the form that church took? And out of that came a really significant shift in the fundamental paradigm about what weekend church and the rest of church life through the week looked like. And you had this whole thing in the kind of contemporary church movement that helped a lot of people feel like church was relevant when they had thought it wasn't anymore. It helped a lot of people feel like they could be themselves when they used to think they had to be in formal spaces. I wonder about those questions. I wonder about re-asking 40 years deep into contemporary, mega church or mega church copycat versions. I wonder about re-asking, why don't my friends want to be in church? Because the research is showing it's not because they're done with faith, and it's not because they're done with God. They're just done with church. And so I think being willing to listen to why and get curious about what it would mean to follow Jesus, but flex the rest of it. And to your point, I don't know if it means you're putting any more buildings anywhere. I don't know if that's where we want to be spending our money, given the challenges and pain of the world. So that's my first pass, and we can go from there.
So you mentioned earlier that you were wondering whether or not you had a question whether or not existing churches are effective. And
right.
So maybe you might want to say something what you mean by effective. That might
Sure.
be the first thing, but maybe it's the same question expressed differently. You just mentioned that data is showing that people aren't really done with God. They're really not done with faith, but they seem to be done with church. And I'll put that word church in quotation marks for a second. Yep. And you think that they are asking different questions. What questions do you think they're asking? And does your church, what would your new plant be thinking about in terms of what is the question and how are you guys thinking you might answer it?
Yeah. So the first point about effectiveness, I think the church models that exist are being effective for a certain group for whom they are effective. And
what group is that?
Well, I think it depends. You think about how many types of church and how many styles are available. And so I understand that there are sort of what we would call a high church space, things that feel formal and maybe almost regal. Mm-hmm. I think for some people who want to have a sense of God being grand, coming into those spaces still feels effective. It gives them a sense of understanding God in their life in a way that helps them capture that God is bigger or other than the human things they see around them. And that's important to them. The contemporary megachurch models, I think, are still effective for folks that are able to keep the schedules that those churches ask for and like the programs those churches offer. And I think to the point of what does effective mean, is it a place where someone feels like they come to know God better, that then they are able to stay connected with God in their everyday life more because they're part of that community? And is it a place where that person feels like they're known and loved and can make friends? So I think to that point, there are a lot of churches that work really well for a lot of people. I'm a little more interested in the group for whom it does not work, because I think one of the things I inherited by diffusion was this idea that people that didn't like my style of church, something must be wrong with them. They weren't trying hard enough, or they weren't giving it a shot, or they weren't putting something in. And I don't know that I think that anymore about why maybe they would choose to not be part of the versions of church that I've been part of up until this point. So I think effective means this community of people help me better understand God, better connect with God in my day-to-day life, and have a sense of being known and loved as a person. I also think effective means this group accomplishes something together that an individual could not perhaps accomplish on their own, which I think is a little bit of why church at all, because there is some question one would have to have about, well, so people are leaving, but they still love God or they still want to be part of faith. Is that okay? Is that enough? Mm-hmm. Maybe, or maybe seasonally. But I do think that groups of people can do more than individuals can across all sorts of problems. I think groups solve problems better than individuals. I think groups take on challenges better than individuals. Better ideas come from groups than just individuals. And so when there is so much wrong and hurting in the world, I still think a group will do more to help than an individual. And so if a group's going to come together to do something good and solve something or right something that's wrong, if that group is doing it because they love Jesus and because the thing that they believe needs to be addressed grieves the heart of God, then that group is still a church. And I think that's pretty important.
Let me ask you again then, or rephrase, what the people who the people are staying away from church, what question are they asking?
Yeah. I think they are asking if people who claim to follow Jesus actually care, not give a. I think they are asking if people who say they follow Jesus actually care about how much is hurt and broken in the world, whether that hurt is in my own life, in my family, or in all the injustice that we see all around us near and far. And the gap in action, I think, makes them wonder, is anyone really doing anything about significant issues in the world around me? And if they're not, then why am I going to bother?
Okay. So, like Pope Francis, I'm a son of the church. I grew up in the church. And my life experience is small, but I've seen enough churches. Everything you've just said, almost every church I know, every pastor, every leadership group in those churches would say something very similar to what you said. They feel like, no, we need to really care for the people out there. We need to show them that we care. People don't feel cared for. Virtually every church I've ever been part of has said something like that. So my question to you is, if that's the question, then you're setting up a new church. How do you intend to answer that question differently? What will that actually look like?
Yeah. Well, so I am not surprised. I think that when Curtis and I speak about what we're trying to do, one of the pieces of response is whether that feels differentiated enough from what other churches say they're trying to do. What I find then is when we move into pushing that towards what we really mean, you see differentiation. So a lot of churches say it, and it's stunning how few women actually get to lead in those spaces. I don't know how you tell me you care about women when you don't let them do anything. A lot of churches say it, and it's stunning how white their stage is. I don't know how you say you care about people when you don't listen to people of color and you don't trust their stories. I hear a lot of them say they care, but they'll spend more money on sending white people to an international location on a so-called missions trip instead of just thinking about giving that money to a locally led partner in that community and maybe changing what travel or visiting or relationship building would look like with that community. And so I think some of it is about the programmatic response to the truth. And you can say, here's the same values, but the programmatic response might look different. You might not do things that every church just assumes you're going to do.
So you're saying that in some of these churches, they probably do have good intentions and mean well, but you seem to feel there's a disconnect between their, and I'll use your word, programmatic efforts. For example, perhaps they say they're sensitive to women, but in fact, they don't display that in their actions by the number of women that are involved in ministry and so forth. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
I think that's at least in part. And of course, I can only speak to the communities that I know, right? So my response, or maybe my probing, is going to be most directed at predominantly white suburban evangelical megachurch or megachurch modeled communities, right? I don't have any authority or voice to speak to the Anglican response to contemporary issues. That's not my tradition. And I'd be, well ignorant and out of my depth. And so when I put a group together, and even then it's very broad brushstrokes, it's the community I come from. I spent the last decade in suburban megachurches. That's what I know. And I know that those communities at the broad level, there are some gaps when it comes to who really gets to do things that matter in that space. And some of that is just simply that a lot of them have become relatively, in their need to be structured and organized and sustainable, they've become very staff driven. So all the cool things about who we're going to be come from kind of a small group at the top. And so, yeah, I think that there's a bit of a need there. I think there are also just gaps to kind of pivot. That right now, in order to be a good church person, I kind of need to come multiple times a week to a property and do things that support programs at that property. And I don't know if people's everyday life, if that's what they want to be doing with their time anymore. And I don't know that that's a new thing, but I think that that's part of the disconnect, is that there might be an interest in following Jesus in my everyday life with the people I come and go with that looks a little bit less like being on a campus a couple times a week and in a small group and so on and so forth.
Your church plant, then, are you saying that where and how will you meet?
Well, at the moment, we meet for dinner on Sunday nights. And so we're starting there. And that is pretty casual and still intentional. And if it turns out that we become a dinner church, then awesome. but also we've kind of decided, and this is what I think is maybe where I'm not as helpful. We've committed to a process of listening to our community and holding off on what form the church is going to take until we can answer that in a way that feels different and tailored to our context. Mm-hmm. So if we had already decided that we were going to be a church that met on a campus with a 30-minute rock band and then a 45-minute sermon, we could just be driving after that and launch in October or something. Mm-hmm. Because we've decided that we are not going to predetermine the form without listening to the community, there's a lot of squish. We mm-hmm. might become a dinner church. We might become a series of house churches. We might meet on a campus at some point, although we're still never going to have a 45-minute talking head. I think that's another gap that some people are feeling, is the stage-based expert. A lot of people are smart and a lot of people want to be talking about their faith and they want to be asking questions, and might be a need for a dialogue-centered community instead of a stage-driven message at this point. So, yeah.
I like one thing that's attractive to me to what you're saying is the way I would put it is you seem to be saying that you're going to go slow and you're going to let the thing develop organically. You're just going to watch it on the ground. And yes. Then it's hokey, but kind of go with the flow, see which way things are moving and go with that. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that is a part of it. We have an intentional set of guideposts for the process. Mm-hmm. We have a partner that's sort of helping us create this church called Communitas International, and they've been sending missionaries to various locations and raising up new churches globally for about 50 years. So there's some structure to it, but they are committed to this idea that we would kind of move through a series of sort of listening processes together, right? One of them they say is like to get embedded in your community. And the way they talk about being embedded is that you belong there when the community says so on its own terms.
Interesting. How will the community tell you that, and how will you know?
Well, I think part of coming back to Southern California is that we know its culture a bit better. I think it's about having friends in spaces through your community. I think some of it is about being a regular in different spaces with your community. I mean, do you know the name of the owner of your taco shop? Mm-hmm. And who's in their family? Mm-hmm. I think some of it is about doing your life within that community, and you sort of understand its challenges and its hurts. And there's a sense of like, if something important is happening here, there are people who would expect you to be showing up into that conversation. So if that's based in your city council chambers, great. But if it's less formal than that, you're there as well. And that there are some people that sort of expect you to care and to be part of it. Mm-hmm. I think some of embedding in the actual town we moved to, for example, was like being at the 4th of July festivities in their Central Park. Like there's sort of a sense of like, if you belong here and if we belong to each other, this is where we are on this holiday. So you stay in town and you go.
You mentioned a group earlier, Boston Church Planting.
Yeah.
So the question I'm having here now is, when you are there any models out there that you and Curtis are looking at that you can point at that are inspiring you, or that you're saying that it's like that? Where would I look? Mm-hmm.
So I would say the Boston group, High Rock.
And tell us again the name of that, please.
Yeah, that's High Rock. They're a covenant church, and the High Rock Network is sort of the group that is committed to creating new churches in Boston. And where we look to them is that they are about locals who love their city. Part of why we realized we couldn't join them is that we're not New Englanders. We're Southern Californians.
Right.
And so we love their model, but for us to transplant to New England felt actually a little off from what it was we were inspired by, which is their pastors are local. They are New Englanders. And they pick a neighborhood in the Boston area that they love, and they physically move there. So a group of people actually locate themselves in a neighborhood, and neighborhoods in Boston are so distinct that a few miles apart, everything about the subculture changes. Mm-hmm. And so they're okay with being incredibly local, and they're very much believing in the power of loving your neighbor. Boston is an interesting case study for new churches because there are droves of outsiders trying to create new churches in Boston, and almost all of them fail. And High Rock has created just 6 or 7 churches over the years, and all of them are self-sustaining, and all of them are connecting with their neighbors. All of them are held in high regard by their community and by their city, and they're just moving bit by bit. And I think a big part of it is that they love their neighbors. And I think a lot of times the churches that come in are believing that they are going to convert those academic, atheistic heathen to the truth with a capital T. And surprisingly, that's not very winsome. People don't really love being told that they're all wrong.
What? Are you sure?
So from them, a lot of it is this idea of deep love. And deep love is a big part of why we came back home. We love Southern California with all of its quirks and challenges and complexity. There's a church in Chicago that's pastored by my friend Amy Dolan. It's called Sunday Supper Church. And they're about a year and some change old. And they are a dinner-based church. They only meet a couple times a month formally, and then they do some house dinners on other nights. And they are about beauty in their meeting space. They are inclusive of their LGBTQ plus siblings and elevating their voices. They have short sermons and time for conversation around a table. And they are really deeply rooted in their city in Chicago. So from them, we take a sense of whose voices are being given the microphone and what are they doing together with their actual gathering time. And they eat, and their sermon is 10 minutes long, and then they talk. And then they close with something I love. They have a dessert benediction so that it is a literal taste of the goodness of God and the goodness we believe is coming in the kingdom of God. And they do a blessing over cake and talk about how they saw Christ in one another over that time. And so there's a lot from them that we have sort of taken inspiration from. And then there's a church in West Michigan, which, hey, if you want to talk about where you do not need another church, there's a church called Open Circle there. And similarly, they're looking for people who've been hurt and heartbroken by church models, but don't want to quit on getting together. They are creating space for LGBTQ people who still want to be in church. They are poking at West Michigan church subculture and wondering if it's possible to follow Jesus without it looking like that. Because that's part of the issue is as a model has been effective, in this case, meaning it got bigger, there is a tendency to say it is what is right. And then if you say, well, I kind of want to do something a little bit different, people for whom it is working feel threatened, and they might feel like, wait a minute, what are you saying about what I love? Are you criticizing me? Are you criticizing what I like from church? It's not that. We're not mad. We don't have any ill will towards that model. We just don't want to do it that way anymore.
If everything, see, part of the problem, not the problem. You have a kind of an opened, at least the way I'm understanding and interpreting it, you're understanding the future for this new church of yours is open, it's sort of open-ended. And so I don't know if my question will actually be effective, but let's just make it up. If I were to walk into your church, whatever that is, in 2 or 3 years, what would I see? Best case scenario, if you're thinking to yourself right now, well, if this works and kind of evolves the way I want it to evolve, it will look sort of like this in 2 or 3 years. What would that look like?
We get asked that a lot. What I cannot answer is what physical space you'd be walking into or how many people you would find there. What I can answer is that I hope the people you find there represent a variety of ethnicities and orientations and sexual identities and all feel like they belong. What I can answer is that I hope that whoever speaks about Scripture and God that day, they are different ages, they are different ethnicities, they are different orientations or gender identities, and that the time that we speak about God and Scripture together is shared among multiple voices. I can answer that we hope that it is a group that feels like they sacrifice for one another and for the good of the world. It's a group that have cultivated each for themselves a rhythm of life, a way of following Jesus in their actual regular everyday life so that they can stay open to what God is doing in them and among us as a community. I sure hope you find a group that feels authentic. And I know that's such a buzzword nowadays, but just the idea that like these are messy, regular people that keep trying to bring themselves to God and keep trying to show up face to face. I hope it's a group that is choosing to put away their phones for a while so that they can do face to face and be in relationship.
Good luck with that.
In all the messy togetherness. And I think that those are the markers that we're hoping kind of animate the group. And then I think 2 to 3 years from now, I hope that all we're doing is trying to live out the one another's from the Bible and neighbor well and do justice. And I hope you don't see a bunch of extra stuff crowding out those 3 things. We're trying to be protective, that's all we do. And we're not going to launch other stuff, even if it's good or even if it's what we usually expected from church, unless it helps us do one of those 3 things.
Mm-hmm. When you talk with friends, people, strangers, anybody, and you explain everything that you've just told me for the last half hour, what's with traditional Christians or any kind of Christian, what's in your experience so far, what's been the biggest pushback on all that?
Oh, certainly LGBTQ inclusion. Absolutely.
And okay, I give up. Inclusion, I don't actually know what the word means. It seems to be a very, how should we say, elastic term.
Yeah.
So when you say inclusion, what do you mean by it, Meredith?
When we say inclusion, we mean that people who belong to that community are not only welcome to be part of our worshiping space, but invited to lead in any way that they are gifted by God to lead. They are invited to serve on our staff if they are called into vocational ministry. They are invited into ordination. We sure hope we're celebrating their weddings and we'd be honored to officiate them. And they are people that we would love to serve with pastoral care as they have needs, just like anybody else in the community. So the fullness of community life in our church is available for someone from the LGBTQ community. There is not a invisible line that limits their participation or the ways that they're served. And I think inclusion's squishy because sometimes it means you're welcome. We'll smile at you. You can have a seat here. But your seat is in the audience. Your seat isn't at the table. And when we say inclusion, we mean the full gamut of what we are as a church is as available to people from the LGBTQ community as it is to people who are straight or cisgendered in the community.
So for some people, they can own the word inclusion, but for a certain group of people, the word inclusion, they get real reluctant if that means affirmation. So are you saying that at this new plant where you're going at, inclusion includes affirmation of their lifestyles or something different?
I think inclusion includes affirmation. And the reason we have not picked the word affirming church is simply a very parsing of the semantics, which is that many of the churches that exist right now that are open and affirming, they belong to the mainline tradition. They are churches that you would expect to see signs and flags and banners outside. They're churches that within their gathering space, you're going to expect to hear a lot about queer Christian issues that are important, social issues that intersect with the queer community. And that's going to be a pretty common topic of conversation. What we imagine as a community is that we're trying to follow Jesus together. And that's going to intersect with all of our lives in all sorts of ways. But our main conversation, our hope as we gather, the airtime that we're giving is still largely devoted to the issues of Christ and the story that God is writing in Scripture and in the world around us. And that is a bit of a hair splitting, but we find that for people from the queer Christian community, sometimes it feels like they can join a church that cares a lot about following Jesus and studying Scripture and has a high view of Scripture's role in their lives, but is not going to be maybe the same subculture around inviting and including them as a queer Christian person. Or they can choose a very affirming space, but it might actually be more theologically liberal than they themselves want to be. It might be more interested in social issues than the unique person of Jesus. We're kind of trying to be a third way in the middle. And so affirming is a word that gets a little tricky because of its connection to that. And that's the only reason that we haven't chosen it until this point. More for, how language gets used in culture than anything else. But as far as the understanding of a person who is queer being made in the image of God and invited to follow Jesus as they are, yes, that's where we are. And then I think a small subpoint, and others, Sarah Bessey, for instance, has an article called Penny in the Air, where she says something similar to what I'm about to say. We're still invited to the same Christian sexual ethic. I pick one person. Ideally, I marry them. Ideally, I stay with them for life. Ideally, we build a family that is stable and healthy and whole together. That's still the pathway that we're pursuing together. And any of us who maybe choose to express ourselves outside of that pathway, then we're looking at what might Christ say to that, and how might Christ invite us into forgiveness and healing and change. So in that way, I think there's consistency. And I think some people hear affirming as against sort of some old biases and stereotypes about promiscuity. And I don't think that's quite the same thing. So I think it's probably worth noting that as well.
You say, I mentioned that you're a pastor of the church here.
Yep.
Are you and Curtis like two pastors, are you the main? How does that work out? Or what's your role there?
I'm a lead pastor. Curtis is a lead pastor. We don't say co-pastors because in a lot of circles we're in, that's code for the woman doing tea and doilies. But technically being something like staff. And so that's the only reason we don't use it is not because it's not true, but just because it has other uses in other spaces that might diminish what it is we mean, which is that we each have lead pastor roles and we're dividing the ministry areas into places that we're passionate about and skilled in. And ultimately, we hope we're not the only two. We'd love to have a couple more people in the mix, whether they're paid staff or volunteer staff, but we don't imagine being the sole folks moving forward. Right.
And just a technical question. If you're calling yourself a pastor, are you ordained? Has that happened?
Licensed. Curtis and I are both licensed. Which is just that we happen to not have been in a denominational church for that purpose.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, sometimes I will ask my guests at the end of a show 2 questions. Mm-hmm. Let me just ask you these 2 questions. Well, before I do that, Meredith, is there something I missed? Is there a question you want me to ask you that I haven't asked, that I haven't thought to ask?
Oh, I don't know that anything particularly comes to mind. I think I alluded to at the beginning that I think that it is probably worth being aware that the current evangelical church offerings might be more limited in the way they're giving space to women, people of color, and queer Christians than it looks on the surface, because a lot of those church spaces have done a really good job with welcome, by which they mean a feeling that they're happy to see you as you come sit in the audience. And I think when you're talking about welcome being, I am welcome to sit at this table, tell you my story, what's important to me, my community, and the culture I come from, and we are going to be different because you listen to me. I think those spaces are limited. And so as much as I wish that we could do this, can't we all just get along with the churches that already exist? I think that there is some significant challenges where it's like, I'm willing to get along with the churches that exist. They won't hire me because I'm a girl. So there might just be some need for new things, not because we couldn't get along, but because power changes how we do church together. And there's a lot more power and money in what's out there right now, affecting how those places feel, even if they also really want to follow Jesus and do good things.
2 questions.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure who listens to my podcast. Probably most of the people are religious people or Christians. But there's also, I think, some people who are non-believers, but people of goodwill who listen to me. And I hope so, but I don't know. If you had one thing that you would like to say, if there was one thing that you could say to people who are already religiously minded or Christians, what is it you want to say to my Christians and religious listeners? What would you say to them?
I would say that I believe that it is possible that God is inviting us to be open to some change in the way our church forms look. And I believe that it might be time to listen to the people who make you really darn angry on the internet and find one of them that you could meet with face to face and really try to listen to where they're coming from and see if you can bridge some gaps together. Because if we can't do that as Jesus followers, I think we're in trouble. And I think that this idea that I am somehow less of a Christian if I did not vote a certain way or understand current political policies a certain way, I think it's time to start poking at that. Like, really, that's what we're saying? You don't love or follow Jesus if we don't see eye to eye on that stuff? I also think if you're a person with privilege and power, it is time for you to start finding some people that you will listen to that don't have those things afforded to them and believe what they say to you.
If you were going to say one thing to my non-believing friends, what would you say to them?
I'm sorry we're assholes sometimes.
Say that again?
I'm sorry we're assholes sometimes.
I don't know if you listened to that's wonderful. I don't know if you listened to one of my podcasts. I had two of my college cohorts, good guys, Andrew Cochran and Ryan Sarkani. And it was in one of my earlier podcasts and we were in school together. And these two guys are super guys. They've really helped me and been incredibly generous getting my podcast set up and gave me a lot of really good advice and pointed me in the right direction. And so I had them on the show. And one of the things in that show I wanted to talk about was college and diversity and stuff like that. Mm. Anyways, they were really good sports and they have good things to say. And at the end, I asked them a question. Well, what would you say to, my believing friends? And then what would you say to the people who are not believers? And they just said, don't be an asshole. That's what they said. That was their message to non-believers. Don't be an asshole.
Well, then mine is a companion message, which is I'm sorry because sometimes we're the assholes. And
I finished with them. I said, well,
I think that.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I finished with those guys and I said, well, I hate to tell you guys, but I've been an asshole sometimes in my own life. And they started laughing. And that's how we ended that discussion. So it sort of sounds like, sorry, do I have to now rate this podcast R or something like that? I don't know. But
I think you have to put the little E in the box for explicit. I think I broke it. I held off earlier on the swearing.
Okay. Well, Whoops. We made it this far.
But as much as a chunk of our conversation was perhaps me differentiating or even distancing from some of the veins of our tradition, the fact is that is my tradition, right? I come from white suburban evangelicalism, and those words are all real messy right now, but I can't say them. It's still we. And we have made choices and we are staying silent on certain important issues, and we have a lot of power and resource that we need to choose how we're allocating. And, we also probably need to be apologetic for the ways that we're not offering ourselves for the good of the world when we should be. So,
Meredith Anne Miller, thank you so much. Very, very intriguing. Can you send me, if they have, some of the links to the Boston Church, to the church in Wisconsin, to two or three of those organizations that you mentioned, if people wanted to take a look at that?
Yeah, certainly.
And also, I will be including your Instagram. It's Meredith Anne Miller at Instagram, or Meredith Anne Miller. Is it at Gmail? Is that right?
Yep.
Meredith Anne Miller at Gmail. You need to spell Anne, A-N-N-E. If you'd like to contact Meredith, you can do that. You can follow her on Instagram if you want to do that.
Yep.
And of course, you can reach me any old time at stevezelt@gmail. And then, if you could send me those things, I'll put that in the show notes.
Sure.
Along with anything else that you might...
Probably should put like the church's info in there too, huh?
Say that again.
I should probably put the church's info in there too, huh?
Right. And I haven't asked, where is your church, and does it have a name?
Well, right now we are having dinner in our home in Claremont, California. The church is Pomona Valley Church. We kind of went with something simple. It's where we are. It's what we are. The Pomona Valley is kind of a broad umbrella for our region. And we want to be connected to kind of a whole area, not just a niche community. So we're on Instagram as at Pomona Valley Church, and on the internet as PomonaValleyChurch.org. And if you happen to live local to where Steve and I live, you can have dinner with us any Sunday for the next 6 weeks at our house, and we'd truly love to see you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being a good sport. It was really good to hear your voice after all these years.
Likewise.
Yeah. So we'll be in touch, and maybe we can do another show down the road again after you get a little bit squared away and you find out what you find out.
Yeah, love to. That'd be great.
Beautiful. Thank you, Meredith.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Have a good day. Bye.
Fabulous music you're listening to is by Jimmy Fontanez. It's called Every Voice. The opening music by Provient Audio. You can find links to both of those guys in the show notes. Come together.